we've been, I can actually drop it in here in case you're interested. We have a running series, as you know, and we've uploaded all of the videos thus far to here. So you'll join the roster.
All right, good. Well, that puts even more pressure on me.
No. Julia was just with us yesterday, speaking on access and accessibility as well. It's excellent. So
yeah,
it's a double feature this week.
Right. No, I saw it. I was there and saw it.
Great.
And so, yeah, I thought it was terrific.
Thanks. We usually give it a couple minutes as people trickle in. So
sure.
Which means, Jacob, you have to say some funny anecdotes.
Oh, is that how that goes?
Yeah.
I don't have anything funny.
You got nothing?
I got nothing. I don't know.
I'd take a dance instead.
Oh yeah. Did I have to come up with something funny quick then? I don't think anybody wants to see me dance. Neil, hello. I see the moon.
Yes, I just landed.
Nice. Oh, good. Oh, fun fact. Apparently, speaking of the moon and space generally, Elon Musk is invested in putting advertisements in space for, among other things, Tesla. That's great.
For the 1996 Olympics, Pepsi proposed projecting their logo onto the surface of the moon.
I'm not totally mad at that. I think that's really funny. That's really funny. Okay, well, people will trickle in, but we should get started. Super happy to have Joe Grangs join us today for the Public Design Course lecture series to speak on a term ubiquitous in the field of public interest design and planning, that being access. So the series, through the lens of the research and practice of our very own faculty, aims to illuminate the many ways these terms can be interpreted and employed. So oftentimes they're used kind of frequently and maybe less interrogated. So for those of you who don't know him, Joe is a professor of urban and regional planning at Taubman College, and his research examines social equity in transportation and land use planning. And he argues for prioritizing transportation investments that improve access to essential destinations for the poor and other disadvantaged travelers. And recently he co-authored a book called From Mobility to Accessibility with Jonathan Levine, also Taubman College, and Lewis Merlin, which argues for an accessibility shift whereby transportation planning and the transportation dimensions of land use planning would be based on people's ability to reach destinations rather than on their ability to simply travel fast. So again, really excited to have you, Joe. Please welcome me or join me in welcoming him.
Thanks so much, Jacob and Anya, for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be here with you, and I think that the Public Design Core initiative is really terrific, and I'm glad I can participate. I'm going to share my screen, so let me get set up. Oh, Jacob,
you should be good now. Yeah, you should be good. Sorry.
All right. Okay, Jacob, thumbs up. Can you see that? Excellent. All right. Well, thanks for letting me share some time with you folks. I'm calling this accessibility, shifting from movement to improving interaction. So this image on the top is showing movement, and we mistakenly plan for that when I think that we ought to be focusing our attention on something that looks more like on the bottom, which is interaction. I'll say more about that, but let me preface this by, since we had a, since Julia McMurrow gave a terrific presentation just yesterday on access, and I'm giving one here now, Access Part 2, I thought I would start by explaining that we use the same terms And we're talking about slightly different things, but fundamentally at the root, what you learned from Julia is the same here today, but I will tell you what I'm doing differently. The way that we're the same when we talk about access and accessibility is it involves this capacity to participate or interact with other people and opportunities, and that we, architects, planners, public officials, pay more attention to designing the built environment in ways that enhance that capacity to participate or interact with opportunities. And in parentheses, this important point is that we do this so that we can allow people to take part in opportunities so that everyone can lead fulfilling lives as they see fit. So at the root, it's very similar to what you learned yesterday, but you're going to notice that mine is going to feel very different than what you learned from Julia in a couple of ways. One is that rather than focusing on disabled people or people who are facing some kind of particular restriction in the way that a building is designed, for example, I'm talking more broadly about all people. And in particular, I'm going to be focusing from the perspective of designing transportation and land use planning. And also, I'm going to be talking at a bigger scale than you learned yesterday. So I'm going to be talking about concepts that deal with at a neighborhood or a city or even a metropolitan region scale. Okay. And with that, I'm going to start with a big question, and that is, what are cities for? Human beings invented cities about 5,000 years ago, and there's a reason they do a lot of good for us. And the answer is, in part, access. And I'm going to explain a little bit about what I mean there. And it's about being connected to other people through access allows for economic productivity and increasing our standards of living. Most people choose not to be self-sufficient. If we produced everything we consumed and we didn't want any company, we could all live like hermits. We could spread ourselves across the land evenly, but instead, we do need cities. We find that coming together in close proximity with lots of other people in the way that this image of Mexico City shows brings a lot of advantages. And those advantages come through this concept of access. Cities provide a rich mixture for accomplishing this increased standard of living because they provide lots of jobs so we can earn money, a wide variety of consumer goods so we can buy stuff with that money that we earn. And cities provide a wide array of services and amenities that enrich our lives. And I'm going to just run through a few examples that would not be possible without access. This is why people choose to cram themselves together in space. One is that we can produce things more efficiently so that we can all consume things more. By the way, I'm not saying any of this is good or bad, but it's an explanation for why we put up with congestion and pollution and other bads of cities. But for example, big factories, silos, warehouses, we can produce things more efficiently, but it requires that people and activities happen in close proximity. Specialization, we can each take turns specializing in some activity and thereby increase our productivity. So for example, a worker can gain skills in one task and not waste time on in-between tasks, or one person could focus on spinning wool into yarn, another person could focus on weaving it into cloth, and another person can focus on folding it up and packaging it, etc. And Chicago stockyards about 120 years ago, like this image is showing, is a good example where prior to big stockyards, butchers worked by themselves in a single market, and they would butcher animals for meat consumption. But when it was turned into a big factory operation, we could start to use all kinds of pieces of the animal, like the hooves into glue and blood into oil and hide into et cetera, et cetera. And that can only happen when lots of people and activities come close together. Also, cities allow us to capitalize on shared skilled labor pools. Now, there are lots of examples here. Let's just take a fun one, like making movies, Los Angeles or Mumbai. These are places where if you want to make a movie, you can do it a lot more cheaply because you can quickly assemble actors, writers, set designers, costume makers, etc. And you can only do that if you can live close together. We can also capitalize on sharing highly specialized skills. And a good example here is the garment industry in New York City, where flexibility is super important. Fashions change fast, and you can't rely on big production processes. You need to stay small because dresses and other clothing change in very unpredictable ways. So a dressmaking firm might share a button maker with 10 other dressmaking firms. Dressmakers could cluster around a bunch of button makers, and they need to be close because buttons are not something that you can make standardized or order out of a catalog. Designers instead need to figure out how to make buttons fast in a particular way, and they need to be close together. And we can only do that if we can live in close proximity. There are lots of other examples, spillover effects, the fact that people live close together through power lunches or going jogging or whatever. People share ideas and they innovate because they're close together. We advance our understanding of one another through arts and culture. This image I'm showing happens to be a tuba concert, and you can't have a tuba concert in the rural outlying lands of North Dakota. You have to be in a city to get that many tuba musicians together. And by the way, Ann Arbor has a tuba concert around the holiday time. Anyway, there are many other examples of why people choose to live in cities, because it helps us elevate our standard of living. Now, I want to say that living in cities is a two-pronged situation. Cities also bring violence and congestion and crime and pollution and all kinds of other things. But my point is that we choose to put up with some of these bads in order to enjoy the goods that come with living in close proximity to other people and other opportunities, which is what we call access. So then let me ask, what is transportation for? Before I said cities were made in part for access. Here, I'm not even saying in part. We travel because we want access. We travel because we want to interact with people or places, and because we understand that there are benefits in doing that. But a wrong answer, and one that most people give, and one that most people who are currently designing the built environment, they say what transportation for is movement, and that's wrong. And that's going to be the gist of my presentation. We need to start thinking about transportation and land use in terms of accessibility and not movement. And to illustrate it, I'm going to give you I want to walk you through a scenario. I want you to imagine that let's say it's a Saturday morning and you need to run 3 errands. They can be any 3 errands. Maybe you need to pick up cash from a cash machine, some groceries, pick up a prescription for your partner. Oddly enough, now you have a friend on the other side of town who has to do exactly those 3 errands, just like you. But your friend lives in a neighborhood, let's call it neighborhood A, which has fast travel speeds. You live in a neighborhood with slow travel speeds. Is your friend better off because she lives in a place with faster speeds? You might be inclined to say yes, because all else being equal, moving faster seems to be more important. If you said yes, you'd be perfectly consistent with what current transportation and land use policy is aimed at, which is moving vehicles as quickly as possible from one place to the next. But speeds alone don't give you a complete picture of how well you're meeting your needs. What's important is also the location of these destinations that you're going to. So if you asked me whether I want to travel fast or slow, I'd say it would depend. I really don't care whether I go fast or slow. What's most important to me, what matters the most, is the sum total of time that it takes for me to accomplish those 3 tasks. Now, if your friend can accomplish those 3 tasks faster than you in a smaller amount of time, then that friend would be better off than you. But if I can complete all these errands in less time by going slow, that's fine with me. Now, how could that be? How could I accomplish those 3 tasks, even if I'm moving slowly? And the answer is in land use. It's in the way that we build our cities and the way that we put our destinations together. If they're close enough together, I can still move slowly and I might be able to accomplish things in a less amount of time. And this is the concept of accessibility. How much interaction, how much opportunities can you achieve in a given amount of time? So let me just walk through and make sure I'm clearly defining the distinctions here. Mobility is the ease of movement. And this graphic is showing a little house, and it's intended to show how much space you can cover in a given amount of time based on speed. Okay, I'm saying that's what we focus on today, and it's wrong. Instead, accessibility is the ease of reaching destinations, denoted by these black dots. So imagine these black dots as being childcare centers or banks or food stores or places of worship, things that are important to you in your life. What's important is whether you can reach them or not. And unfortunately, policy right now is dominated by the one on the top. We don't care about the destinations, and I'm saying that we need to do that. I'm going to walk you through yet one more scenario to show you how dominant mobility thinking, the top one here, how much it dominates our thinking. Here's a scenario. So imagine now 2 drivers leaving downtown to head home at the end of the day. So they're leaving a city and they go, each of them are driving in a car, and each of them sits in congested traffic for the first 10 miles from their commute. But at that point, after 10 miles, their paths can diverge. The first one, the blue one, is at home. The second one, the red one, still has another 20 miles to drive, but it's not congested anymore. She's able to get to her destination 20 miles more in free-flowing traffic. Now, who's got the better commute? All of our policy, all of our metrics would say that the red one is the better one. So measures like average speed, the percent of time in congested travel, average delay, Texas Transportation Institute metrics on congestion, everything would tell you that the red one is better. But which one would you rather have? The blue one, because it leaves you with more time to spend with your kids, to go recreate, to do whatever you want to do. The blue one, for most of us, is what we really care about. And yet our metrics are inaccurately telling us that the red one is the better one. So this is what we do now. So if you think about this top level as our goal, we say inaccurately, in my judgment, that mobility or movement or speed is what we're after. It's our top priority, and we do a bunch of different things to make that happen. We expand our roadways, we carry out things that planners call travel demand management. We fiddle around with signal timing, we make parking easier, a lot of different things, all aimed at moving vehicles faster. And I'm saying that we've got to get rid of that. And instead, we're going to put accessibility as our goal, accessibility being the ease of reaching destinations or the amount of interaction that you can accomplish in a given amount of time. And then there are a bunch of ways that we can focus on helping us accomplish that. One is indeed movement. All else being equal, yes, faster speed. is better than slower, but all else is not equal. Another way is connectivity. All of us right now are interacting with one another, and we're not doing any traveling at all, other than the fact that I had to walk down into my basement. But otherwise, this is connectivity. This is an opportunity. This is interaction between you and me, and we're achieving accessibility without having to travel at all. But then another one is proximity, the way that we build our cities, the way that we construct our built environments. Proximity allows us to reach more opportunities than if we have things spread out. Now, here's the kicker. These two things, movement and proximity, are in tension with one another. All right, so this is a key relationship that we overlook when we focus incorrectly on movement alone. Think of it, I'm not going to get into this too much, but downtown Manhattan, super high proximity, slow travel. You're not going to move real fast. You're not going to be speeding around Manhattan at 70 miles an hour. Now, on the flip side, think of a far-flung suburban setting where there's just a few scattered big box stores or something. And you can imagine zipping along a freeway at 70 or even 80 miles an hour, but you're not encountering very many things. All right, so that's the idea of the tension between these two things. And when we inaccurately plan just for this one, mobility, we end up hurting proximity, and that's what we call sprawl. We keep building more and more roads, and it prompts more movement out, further and further out. So let me do this. Let me walk you through why this kind of thinking, elevating accessibility as the goal rather than mobility, is important. First, it does put accessibility at the top. And I think that it's fair to say that that is what we want. If I wanted to go into Taubman College this afternoon rather than stay here at home, and I could do it like they do it on Star Trek, where I could just be beamed, I'd do it, because it isn't the travel that most of us care about. Yes, we do like to take a Sunday drive, and yes, we do like to listen to tunes in the car, but for the most part, it isn't the movement that we care about. It's getting to Taubman College. It's getting to the places and the people that we want to interact with that's important. So another dimension that's important is that it's this thinking demotes mobility in the hierarchy of importance. It shows that mobility is important, but it isn't the most important thing. This thinking also opens up new possibilities for achieving our goals. We can achieve goals through proximity and connectivity. By proximity, I mean through the way that we plan and build neighborhoods and cities. But this relationship, it also shows that mobility can be harmful, and we've overlooked that, and that is what has fueled sprawl. And finally is that I want to say that accessibility thinking is essential for advancing social equity. Given that I have limited time, this is what I specialize in, but I'm going to have to give you just a quick overview of it, but in the following ways. First of all, we recognize that what's important in people's lives are things like jobs, food, healthcare, schools, recreation, participating in the political process, visiting friends and loved ones. Those are the things that enrich our lives. But when transportation planners completely ignore those things and only focus on roadway and moving vehicles on them, then we're making mistakes and missing an opportunity to understand how well a transportation system succeeds or not. So without making accessibility, the ability to reach destinations, as our overriding concern, we're going to continue to undermine this, because these things that are important to us keep spreading out in the ways that our cities are built. And here's how it harms social equity. When we spread things out in the form of sprawl, it disproportionately harms poor people, low-income people, and people of color who remain disproportionately clustered in the center of our metropolitan spaces in the United States. So they are confined to the center portions of metropolitan areas, even while our fringes continue to expand. Another way is that by focusing on mobility, mobility makes the mistake of focusing strictly on infrastructure, not people. In other words, we look at a chunk of roadway and we ask, how fast can a vehicle move across it? And it lulls us into thinking that things are equitable, that the person who's driving the jalopy is experiencing that piece of roadway exactly as the person who's driving a Mercedes. And that just doesn't help us very much because it says nothing about whether that person in the jalopy is actually getting to the destinations that he or she cares about, like healthcare and banks and grocery stores. Another reason is that when we focus on mobility, it actually leaves us very unclear on whether a traveler is experiencing disadvantage or not. Here's how we typically do it. We typically add up how much somebody travels, and we find that people that we already know tend to be disadvantaged. Women and people of color are good examples. They tend to travel much less than counterparts, than white people and men, for example. And why? And the mistake is that we equate that less travel as being somehow advantageous, that travel is viewed as a cost. And so if they don't have to travel as much, they must be doing better. When actually it's the opposite. The travel isn't what's important. Some disadvantaged travelers travel less simply because they have fewer choices. Women are a really good example. Historically and all the way up until today, even in our own society, women continue to bear the biggest brunt of household activities. They tend to spend more time at home. They tend to spend more travel close to home, shuttling kids to various activities, while men tend to participate much more broadly in activities. So that's just an example. If all we look at is the travel and not where people are getting to, we have no way of deciding whether people are experiencing the benefits of a transportation system or not. Now, I don't have time to go through this is an ugly graphic, I grant you, but I'm not going to walk you through it. It's just simply to show that we can measure this thing called accessibility. We can measure it and then lay it out on a map, and we can see, for example, that red is where people don't have good access to supermarkets, and green is where people do have good access to supermarkets. And then we can look behind the data and see who lives in these zones, who gets to access supermarkets with good prices and good food choices. Only by looking at accessibility rather than movement alone can we answer questions like that. There are other dimensions that I don't have time to get into now, but that's why I care about focusing on accessibility rather than movement. And I want to also say that I've talked about this idea of access strictly through the lens of transportation and land use planning, but that's not the be all end all. There are all kinds of other impediments that hold people back from living rich and fulfilling lives. You know, a transportation planner can help somebody get to the door of a hospital, but somebody else is going to have to help that person get into the door of the hospital by having medical insurance or knowing which doctor is available to help, as an example, or getting to food stores, or overcoming impediments like licenses and other kinds of credentials. So there are a range of ways that hold people back from engaging in opportunities in space. I've focused on transportation and land use. I hope that I can help with that part of the access equation, but that other people can also start thinking about how to increase access to food stores, to childcare centers, etc. I'm gonna wrap up by concluding and saying that I'm hoping that we can start thinking the next time that a policy, and by the way, the infrastructure bill was passed just yesterday, and doggone it, it's mostly about mobility. Maybe we can come to that in the Q&A, but when we take steps to increase mobility, let's also ask, is this helping or is it hurting accessibility? Progressive approaches to transportation planning will be enhanced when planners, engineers, public officials of cities and regions stop asking this question, how can we keep the cars flowing smoothly? And instead start asking a more complicated question, how can we become a more accessible place for the people who will live here? It's a different approach with different data and different thinking, but until we dislodge ourselves from this old thinking, we're going to continue to perpetuate a status quo that leaves too many people behind. And with that, I'm going to conclude and stop sharing. And then I would welcome any questions or comments.
Joe, we have a mix of students here. And so for the purposes of addressing maybe some basic questions that architecture students might have, it seems like understanding accessibility in your work and research requires quantitative and qualitative understanding of access. And if you could help us understand a little bit about the methodology, really superficially, that a planner uses to understand data sets when we begin to analyze access, I think that would be very helpful to us as architects where we have trouble wrapping our brains around how policies are made.
Yep, that's a great question, Anya. Let me start by saying, first of all, I don't want any of you, whether you're architects, designers, planners, to let the complexity of the concept get in the way. And what I mean here is that it's the idea that's important, that even if you take a crude approach, going onto Google Maps and looking at how many restaurants you can reach within, a judgment of a 10-minute bike ride or whatever, even that goes way farther than the way we just assume that if we can make people move faster, that they will be better off, and that it isn't necessarily the case. But there are levels of refinement and rigor that we can take. And I guess I've closed my slides. It's probably not worth bringing them back up, but GIS, Geographic Information Systems, is a really important tool in this. GIS is a tool that takes data and just instead of viewing it in a table of data and running queries and running statistical tests on it, all of that data gets attached to place. Okay, so location becomes the organizing principle of our data. And so I can map out where banks are, childcare centers, grocery stores, and then there are data available from planning agencies about how fast you can move from point A to point B on roadways, on bus systems, on rail systems, on bikes, etc. And you combine all of this. And the easiest way to think about it is, think about comparing your house to a friend's house. And you just draw a circle around each of your houses and add up what's inside. And that is a crude and simple way of thinking about things that you can reach. Anya, I'm not sure I'm giving a real good answer here, but I didn't want to get into the technicalities too much. I'm hoping that the idea comes through, and I hope that the technical aspects don't get in the way of that.
It comes through.
Good.
I just wanted to mention that there are questions coming into the chat. So, Ana Paula, I don't know if you wanted to ask the question yourself or if you want us to read it off, however you prefer, but.
Oh no, it's just that I know of like when talking about cycling lanes or metro versus buses. I know that Joe has great work about it, about the fairness, about choices in public transit and equity. I just thought it would be an interesting conversation.
Thank you, Ana Paula. Let me say something about different modes. We call transportation planners think of different modes as being car versus bus versus train versus bike versus walking, etc. And everything that I've talked about here today is agnostic to that. The ideas pertain no matter how you go, but there are really important differences among these things. First of all, in the United States especially, so much prominence has been granted to automobiles that it gets in the way of many of the other modes. And by getting in the way, I mean, first of all, how much space. I don't know about you, I bike and walk a lot, and even in a progressive college town like Ann Arbor, it is a scary place to bike and walk because cars just dominate so much. But it's even worse than that. I teach my transportation planning students the following. Of these modes, cars are in one category and all of the rest are in another category. So the other category here is biking, walking, taking a bus. And what unites all of these other things is that they require a walking trip at the beginning and the end. Now, cars do too, but it's a little different because our walking usually is just out to our driveway or garage or a parking structure. And the way that these two things work is that they are in opposition to one another. Cars work best when we spread things out. All of the other ones work best when we bring destinations closer together. And US policy has dominated by pushing cars so much that it has spread our metropolitan spaces to the point where it's almost impossible to thrive without a car. It's sad, but and it's different from other parts of the world, but if you don't have a car, you are severely disadvantaged in the United States because so many things have been spread out to accommodate automobiles. So, so Ana Paula, thanks for raising the question of the modes. In terms of public transit itself, I view public transit as being super important because of the fact that so many people are disadvantaged by not having cars in metropolitan spaces that have been deliberately built to accommodate cars. And I'm really worried about the coming 1 or 2 years after COVID. I think that public transport is in very, very dire circumstances. By the way that we fund things. I mean, think about Detroit as a really good example. Detroit is a place that faces very high levels of poverty. A very high share of poor people who live in Detroit can't afford cars, and their lives are severely disadvantaged compared to people who have cars. For example, no, by the way, I want to make clear that there are lots of people who choose not to drive for good reasons, environmental reasons, etc. But in this environment, it means that you can't get to the big box grocery store that offers a rich, wide range of different kinds of foods at low prices. And instead, you might have to take a bus or ride a bike or walk to a store that offers far fewer choices at very exorbitant prices. And that's just one way that poor people feel disadvantage compounded upon them. I should stop, Ana Paula. I think I've started to riff in a different tangent.
No, that sounds great. Thank you.
Any other questions, especially from students? I do know that I'm speaking mostly to architecture students, and I hope it doesn't sound like gibberish. We do tend to speak in different languages and different approaches and different ideas, but I would love to see if I can clarify anything or help any of you in understanding what I've presented.
I have one, but I'll wait to see if students have a question first.
Great.
Here comes Simon.
Hey, Simon, it's good to see you. You know all this stuff already.
Hi, Joe. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I took Joe's transportation class last winter, and it was amazing. It was my favorite class. And not to blow smoke, but I think Joe's a great professor. And if you have an opportunity to take a class with him, I would do that. I'm sure I'm embarrassing him, so let me wrap up my compliments. So my question is, with everything you mentioned Detroit, I'm thinking about Metro Detroit. That's what I think about a lot. We are so sprawled out. And I think planners in the Metro Detroit region are not doing transit-oriented development very well. And I was wondering how you think we could transform our region to incorporate public transit better. There's, obviously pushback from governments and politicians. How do you think we can improve? I mean, that's the $1 million question. How do you think we can improve the Metro Detroit public transit, transportation, land use, all of it? How do we increase public transit for equity's sake? I think that's the biggest issue, is equity.
Well, you hit the nail on the head with your very last sentence, but thanks for your kind words too, Simon. What I mean by your last sentence is that people who advocate for stronger public transit have in some ways harmed themselves in recent years. And it stems from the fact that so few people ride public transit in the United States that they always face a huge political battle when they want to strengthen it. And we're talking about a tiny percentage of people who ride public transit. And so in order to overcome that, they often will say that public transit accomplishes a zillion wonderful things. It helps get other cars off the road and helps with congestion. It helps with environmental purposes. It helps people who can't drive get to where they need to go. And the list goes on and on and on, to the point where I think that it has confused people who need to make decisions. My own view is that I think we ought to clarify what the overarching purpose of public transit is. And in my mind, it's helping people who don't have other options of travel, people who don't have cars, take part in the larger metropolitan economy, to get to suburban jobs, get to places of worship, get to stores that they like and want to go to, even if they don't have a car. And if we could help focus our attention on that, it would help reduce the muddle around all of these arguments for what public transit should be. And then we can start to make decisions. I hate to say this, Simon, but anybody who cares about Detroit, I think we're unfortunately facing the awful situation where we're going to have to cut back on public transit in a city that already faces really bad service. But given the way that funding is after COVID, and I think that in order to make those cutbacks effectively, we've got to learn how to focus on the people who need it the most. It can't, what I'm trying to say, Simon, is transit can't be the be all end all for everyone. It can't simultaneously serve that person who lives in far-flung Oakland County while also being good at helping the poor household living in Detroit get to a job in Oakland County. We have to make some hard choices, and getting rid of some of that muddle would help. Transit-oriented development, let me say a quick word on that. So what transit-oriented development means, it's a movement that's promoted at the federal level, state level, et cetera. The idea is a good one. It's, why don't we start building housing and retail and even commercial in a compact way that helps people live and work and recreate in smaller spaces, and then you run transit lines through that neighborhood, if you will, to help people get to other places. That's transit-oriented development, and it's a good one. Now you can look at it in two ways, and accessibility helps us clear this up. One is if you care about people, getting middle-class people out of cars, which is a worthy goal because pollution is a problem, we drive too much, and climate change is real. So maybe we can help people shed a second or third car in a household if you move to a transit orient. That's a good thing, but notice that it is completely different than if instead we say that our top priority is helping transit dependent people, people who don't have a car at all ought to be able to live there. Now there's a conflict here because if we care about that environmental purpose, a good one, it means that middle-class people will push out poor people from transit-oriented development. And so again, my view is let's prioritize the equity question, make sure that we leave enough housing for low-income households to live in transit-oriented development. Then we can start thinking about allowing middle-class and even upper-class people live in spaces that allow them to shed the cars.
Yeah, I think everything that you just said makes sense. I think we obviously need to focus on low income people. I think there's such a city versus suburb divide that has persisted in the Southeast, in our region for decades. And a lot of that is racial in nature. Yeah.
You're right. You're
right,
a lot Simon.
I think that's the big problem, is that there's a city versus suburb divide, and then the fact that public transit has such a negative connotation. Like, middle class people don't like the idea of buses, and transit or rail costs so much more money, and there's hardly any rail money included in the bipartisan infrastructure bill that just passed the Senate. So I guess it's really fluid right now.
I'll try to make this short. Just a quick response to this other great point you're making, Simon. Part of the problem is that transportation policy in the United States is governed mostly through agencies at a regional scale. So in Detroit, many of you probably aren't aware, but there's an agency called the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments, SEMCOG. All right, they handle about $1 billion in federal funds. It comes to this regional agency, and they divvy it out to projects throughout the 7-county region. The problem for 50 years now is that these agencies are extremely undemocratic. They're opaque to the citizenry. And they are dominated by suburban interests. And given that so few people ride transit, suburban interests are not interested in supporting transit. So if you're interested in getting active around transportation issues, one thing that we need to change is that mechanism. We've got to be able, we have to move beyond, we either have to make these regional agencies more democratic by getting more people involved and on a population weighted basis, so that Livingston County doesn't have the same weight in decision making as Wayne County, for example. That is a really big impediment to supporting public transit. So get out there and advocate for democratic regional transportation planning.
I just one quick thing. I know I'm talking a bunch. I just wanted to let you know, Joe, that I'm taking Jonathan Levine's transportation and land use planning class in the fall, and I'm really excited about it.
Good. Keep going, Simon. Come and visit me and let me know how that's going.
I will.
Joe, I wanted to ask a question, and thank you for this presentation. Thank you for the presentation and also contextualizing it, I think, in the beginning as a kind of a scale shift from yesterday's conversation. And I think what you're talking about this kind of muddled delivery mechanism of information is super useful to think about, in that we are a room of both architects and planners, and like recognizing that there are connective tissues between these scales. And so one thing I think about as you're talking about the accessibility of public transportation is literally like the very localized moment. So literally the 6-inch curb, that if you cannot ascend that, you cannot then get on the bus that can take you to what you need to get to. So the whole system breaks down at that moment for certain people. Or even like in the 80s, when accessible buses were introduced in like cities like Los Angeles, there were buses that were equipped with the lifts, but the bus drivers wouldn't use them because it would slow down their route. So they weren't getting to they weren't able to keep the timetable that had been established. And so just these like repercussions kind of up and down the spectrum, I think those are really fascinating, that like basically all of us in this room, like we all need to have our hands on this and to be able to basically share like, oh, at this scale, this thing is happening, or this policy is being, considered. And so I think your kind of calls to understand that and to kind of think about the mechanisms for affecting hearts and minds on this. I think that's a really beautiful sentiment, and I think a really useful thing, for the congregation of us to kind of consider. So I just wanted to sort of, highlight those connections and propose that we keep going with this in thinking at these different scales.
That's really great, Julia. Thanks for mentioning that. I got a lot out of your talk yesterday, and I've been thinking about it ever since. So I'm glad I stepped in. I wanted to see if we were talking about different things, and like I say, at the root, it's really the same.
For sure.
And note that I also ended my talk in this similar vein that you're talking about. I wanted to say that it's not just transportation and land use planning here, that public health officials have something to say about how people get into the door of a medical clinic and all of that. So yeah, I really like the way you put that we can keep this foremost in our minds across our various specialties, I hope.
Yeah.
I probably should have had on that slide where I was showing the similarities and differences between Julia's and my presentation. I probably should have included that her graphics put mine to embarrassment, but that's to be expected. I loved your graphics, Julia.
Thank you. That's great. It's a nervous habit of mine. When in doubt, make a graphic. It's like knitting.
I was struck by it, though. I probably ought to come and talk to you sometime, because this is complex enough and it's important enough that we can communicate to a broad constituency that I need to figure out how to make this complicated stuff more accessible, if you will.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that I guess that's a little bit maybe where I was like, how does the word get out, right? Like, and I think there are, obviously with social media connections, there are new channels that didn't exist 20 years ago, let's say. And so I think there's a little bit that it's a bit of a free for all, but also there are like, if there's an agreement to kind of like work together, like how do we, I mean, it's almost like, I think back to like propaganda posters or something, like in the best possible sense of that word, like what is the way that the message can be clearly delivered? Because it's helpful. Like if you don't know what's possible, you don't care, to be honest. Yeah.
Right. Cool.
So yeah, I'm on board. Let's chat.
All right.
We have to admit that this Joe Julia show that's emerging is probably the highlight of our summer semester.
Seriously, yeah.
Yeah.
This is kind of the hope.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. We cross into other disciplines. We tread lightly. We learn new terminology. We gain respect for each other's work. And maybe, just maybe, there's a spark of possibility to collaborate.
Yep.
Yeah. It's been wonderful to hear you back to back.
All right.
Yeah, I was actually wondering yesterday, like, what do they mean part one? What? And then when I saw the email today, I'm like, oh, I got to go check out part two. Yeah, well played, Public Design Corps.
I know it's, well, just a quick comment, and it's sort of it's really, yeah, I agree with Anya. It's amazing to see the kind of overlap between you and Julia. Lucky guess, I guess, on our part, but I think in part it's because, Joe, when you're talking about this, like you're talking about access and like flipping destiny, like the end is about access and not just about speed, which then is thinking about like transit predominantly, like Julia's saying it, like yeah, like a destination level, right? Instead of like, you know, optimizing speed of roads or something. I'm not going to phrase this right because I'm not a planner, but what I'm interested in is how you see your, at least to me, your approach in a good way is counterintuitive. Because when I think about mobility, you're right, I'm thinking about like optimization, like getting from A to B. You're saying it's not, that's the wrong way to think about it. I agree with you now. But I wonder how that plays out in something like the infrastructure bill. Like if you think that that traditional understanding that I have, say, moves like kind of permeates to policy, and how you would like to see that money spent, I guess. Like what do you want to, what is the ideal scenario, if not kind of optimizing road speed, or transit speed?
Great question, Jacob. Thanks for the chance to address that. And first of all, it's a gigantic bill, as you all know. I haven't digested it, but essentially my beef with it right now is that it's so common for politics like this to happen, where an opportunity presented itself. Biden was able to bring Republicans and others together. And it's a good thing that we passed this bill, in my estimation. It accomplishes lots of good things, but it also, for expediency's sake, there's a tendency to just take what we did before and bring it forward. And so this bill is bringing forward previous federal bills from 5 years ago and 9 years ago, and many of those same common issues. And here's what this is what to me is the key. I wish that all of the money that goes to highways was to what we call fix it first. That is, think about Michigan roads. Whether you're Republican, Democrat, whatever, our roads stink. And Ann Arbor, our roads stink. We just simply need to fix them. But instead, this bill is expanding roadway capacity. And I think one important step would be simply pause the expansion, fix everything first, and make sure that you're using other funds to enhance all of the other non-highway things like buses and trains. Then maybe we think about expanding highways, but the expanding highways is super dangerous in my mind, because as my presentation, I tried to make clear, as we increase expansion of freeways, it prompts a movement of destinations out farther and farther. The next Burger King, the next Costco will move farther and farther out because it's easier to travel farther and farther out. And once you imprint that pattern, it's difficult to go back. And that spreading pattern undermines all of the other modes like transit and walking and biking. So it's not an easy answer, Jacob, but that's what I would point to. Stop expanding freeways, fix them first.
Yeah, it's funny because I think ironically, I saw that there's $1 billion dedicated, which is relatively very small, dedicated to reconnecting communities disproportionately Black that were divided by highways and other infrastructure. So the you're both expanding highways and like cleaning up your mess, sort of, with a very relatively small amount of money. So anyway, this is very helpful, your response.
Oh, good. I should probably stop, right?
I mean, I would love to continue, but we should be respectful of everybody's time. Thank you so much. This is absolutely amazing. It's really a pleasure to have you.
Oh, good.
And thanks to everyone for joining. We'll have this lecture up very soon. So, and we'll send it to the rest of the group. But thanks again, Joe, for coming.
It was such a pleasure. Thanks so much for asking me, and it was good to see you all here. Thanks for coming out. Come and visit me, any of you students, if you want to take my course. I teach URP 561, Transportation and Public Policy, in the winter term. All right. Take care,
Awesome.
everyone.
See you. Bye.